know who has, but we've had some folks looking at our videos. There's been like 30, which has been kind of a surprise. Have any of you seen the video? Have any of you had a chance to look at them and were you able to watch them? Where they make sense?
I missed a week, and the video was actually it was great. We weren't that close during the video.
I started to say the video was better than being here. That's really what you're saying, right? Well, I'm going to go back and hit a couple of points from last week that we talked about. These are kind of the issues that we hit last week that we didn't really complete, and then we're going to get into the Hellenistic period. And you're going to need to be in Daniel. Everything we're going to do is going to be in the book of Daniel. So you're going to want to start in chapter 2, and then we're going to jump to probably chapter 8, but it's all going to be out of the book of Daniel. Now, let me just hit a couple of the things that we talked about in another announcement. Next week, if you are in this room, you will be here by yourself. And I'll tell you why. Well, first of all, I guess I should ask for the night off. Deborah and I are going to Kirk, Colorado, and look it up. You'll enjoy it. Our oldest grandson is a senior this year, and Thursday night is senior night, and I think his last home football game. Well, the regular season. So we're going to go out and see not just him, 5 grandsons. And our daughters might be there. Doesn't make much difference. But we see all 5 grandsons and sons-in-law and daughters. And so with your permission, we won't be here next week. We'll be here the following week. Okay?
Don't forget to stop at one stoplight.
Actually, there isn't any. Did you find that? There's one stop sign, and it often is down. So for those of you who don't know, Kirk is just west of Idalia and just east of Joe's. That should help you. Now, last week, you might recall, Dale, who conveniently said he wouldn't be here this week because he had a homework assignment. Do you remember that? So Dale asked the question about who them was or who those were in a citation that we read. So we're going to read it again, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then we'll come back to a couple of other things that we have left a little bit hanging so I can flesh them out before we spend time in the Hellenistic period. So you're going to want to go to Daniel chapter 2, and we're going to be in verse 36 to 45, which is what we read last week. And you might recall that this chapter deals with the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and he tells all his minions, all the people who are supposed to be advisors to him, I want you to interpret the dream for me. And they said, great, tell us what the dream is. And he said, no, you tell me what I dreamt, and then you interpret it. And what would happen was if they couldn't, it was off with their heads. Well, by this time, Daniel, still fairly young, but in the court of Nebuchadnezzar, is going to be included in that group. And he goes to Nebuchadnezzar's servant, and he says, I can't interpret the dream, but I can tell you who can. It's God Almighty. So he asks for an audience with Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar gives him the audience. Daniel spends the night praying with his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then it's revealed to him what the dream was. So the next day he goes in and he says to Nebuchadnezzar, all right, I not only can tell you the dream, I can tell you the interpretation. And that's what we're going to look at in his interpretation. You want to probably be looking either at this slide or the one in your packet, because that's what this is going to deal with. Start with me in verse 36. This is the dream, and now we will interpret it to the king. You, O king, are the king of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands he has placed mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds of the air. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all. You are that head of gold. After you, another kingdom will rise inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. Yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, and even as you saw the iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with the baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. In the meantime, in the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it will last and endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, the gold into pieces. So Daniel had said, here's the dream, and he describes this statue. And then he comes back and he says, here's the pieces of the statue. And if you'll notice, he goes through all the kingdoms that we've been talking about, all of which are in the intertestamental period. The Babylonian kingdom is going to usher in the intertestamental period when Persia takes over in 539. So he talks about the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and then he says after all this, there's going to be one kingdom left. So the question Dale was asking was, he said, who was he talking about when he gets to this? All those he will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. So who is the them he's talking about? It's actually two pieces. Remember how we've talked about short-term view of prophecy and long-term view of prophecy? The short-term view of prophecy is he's saying all of these kingdoms will be crushed. They will. But then he goes on and talks about this other kingdom, and he says it lasts forever. What that means is not only all these kingdoms, but all mankind's kingdoms will be crushed. Now, chapter 7 is kind of the corresponding chapter to this in Daniel, and chapter 7 is going to do the same thing. It's going to talk about the same kingdoms in slightly different terms, but it's going to be talking about the future. When you get to chapter 6 of Daniel, from chapter 6 on, Daniel's talking about long-term prophecy, and we'll see a little bit of that tonight as well. So the them that Daniel's referring to here is not just these kingdoms, but all other kingdoms. And the fifth kingdom is going to be the kingdom of Christ, when Christ comes to set up his kingdom. So the answer to Dale's question was, these kingdoms and every kingdom in the future will eventually be crushed, and all will bend the knee to the Lord Jesus. So that was our first piece of the puzzle from last week. We had another one, and I think I may have confused the issue for Sarah, and unfortunately she's not here tonight. But she had asked the question because I had talked about just before the Greeks conquer the Persians, there is a revolt, I guess is the best way to say it. Started by the Phoenicians, and they were on the coast, but they kind of drugged the Jews into it. They drugged Israel into it, and they're revolting against the Persian kingdom. So the Persians at the time, under the ruler Artaxerxes, one of the Artaxerxes, in 359, deported a substantial number of the Jews to a place called Hyrcania. And I made the point that that may have been where Paul's letter to the Galatians was written. And later Sarah asked me about it, and she said, did you say the letter to the Galatians? I said, yes. I got to thinking about that, and I just want to make sure it still could have been part of this group that gets deported, or the diaspora that we've talked about, that gets taken into another land. But the issue should be, or the more appropriate way to look at this is the Caspian Sea, this is the Black Sea. When we're talking about Hyrcania, ancient times, it's more of this region right here. Now, for those of you who have seen the maps of Paul's travels, which we're going to see when we get to Acts, when we get into part 2 of this, Galatia is in an area right here. In fact, Tarsus, Paul of Tarsus is right about here. So Galatia is a little bit further east, and the point that I was trying to make is that throughout Israel's history, there's going to be this dispersion. The letter to the Galatians, some believe could have been the very first letter, if it wasn't 1 Thessalonians. And the question then would be, would it have been written to the northern Galatians or to the southern Galatians? So I hope Sarah, and I'll have to let Sarah know that, the Galatians letter may or may not have been to this particular group of the diaspora, but it's still important to note they were dispersed and carried throughout the lands. And when Paul goes into, in fact, his first missionary journey is going to be in southern Galatia, that's where he's going to find compatriots, Jewish compatriots. And now let me give you the last thing that I've kind of talked about several times. And let me tell you the problem and we all have this in whatever professional life we're in or whatever kind of life, we tend to get into our own jargon, don't we? We tend to say, well, I had an engineering business for years, and whenever I would just assume that everybody knew that GPM at gallons per minute. I mean, why wouldn't you know that, right? So we get to the point where we think that everybody knows what we're talking about without really explaining it. Several times I've talked about the West Bank, and I want to spend a little time with that so we know for sure what area we're talking about. As soon as I find the right slide, let's go here. This was part of our conversation when we were talking about how Samaria was resettled with outsiders. And we got to talking about modern day, where would that be? And I mentioned when we talked about where the Palestinians were today, I said they occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Well, if you don't know where the West Bank is, you might be thinking the West Bank of what? So let me kind of hone in on it. And fortunately, this does a pretty good job. We're going to get to this slide later because this is during the time of the Maccabees. But you see where Samaria is right here, that kind of outline of Samaria? That's pretty much the West Bank today. Not exactly, but fairly close. And it's the West Bank of the Jordan River. That's why it's called the West Bank. So if you looked at it today, the West Bank would be about the area of Samaria. And then you get down to Jerusalem, and it kind of carves out Jerusalem and comes a little further down to about halfway down in the Dead Sea. That's the West Bank. That's the occupied area by Palestinians. The Gaza Strip, which is right here, except it's only about half this size now, the Gaza Strip is the other area. That's where everything's happening today.
Question. When was the West Bank designated as the West Bank?
1948.
Boy, that same thing.
Yep. Well, it probably took the term of the West Bank, but 1948 is when Israel becomes a nation again. It actually probably happened in 1947 under partition is when it began, they started calling it the West Bank. So about that period of time. And then the Gaza Strip was always called Gaza. Does that help kind of situate where things are? I hate to leave people thinking, what's the West Bank and what's Gaza? That's the area we're talking, and the area we're talking about today, Palestinians still occupy the West Bank. The Gaza Strip is what we're talking about today. That's where Hamas headquarters are. All right, now that I've got all the corrections to my mistakes over the weeks, let's move on to the Hellenistic period. Before we look at the Hellenistic period, let's go back to this slide. This is kind of our home base slide on how things were happening. And we've talked about this before, but as we get into it, it's going to make more sense. If you look at the first 4 bullet points, The Persian period we just finished. Now we're in something called the Greek or Macedonian period. The overall title for that is going to be Hellenization. And it's actually going to take a period of up to about 167 BC, and it's going to include the Greek period, the Egyptian period, and the Syrian period. Well, why would all of that be under Hellenization? Why would all that be considered part of the period of Hellenization or the Greek period? Well, the reason, and you'll see it tonight, is that the Egyptians and the Syrians are developed from Alexander the Great's generals. So really, all of them are Greek in nature. That's why it's called the Hellenized period. And I'll make that a little more obvious as we get into it. But when you see these periods, group all these 3 bullet points. I'm pointing at them right here. Can't you see it? The Greeks, the Egyptian period, and the Syrian period, that's all called the period of Hellenization. And it will take from 332 to 167, the longest period of all the ones we're studying. Now, let's go back down here and look at what that meant. Alexander the Great, we talked about last week, conquers the known world in roughly whatever the period of time I have there. I want you to note something we talked about already. Do you remember we talked about the land bridge? Does everybody remember what the land bridge is? There we go. You see that little strip right there? We talked about this last week. That's the land bridge that connects the 2 most powerful kingdoms in the area at the time, Egypt and Asia. And that land bridge, right about in the middle of it, sits tiny little Israel, about the size of the state of New Jersey. And we pointed out last week, Israel wasn't important because it was Israel. Israel was important strategically because that's how you got from point A to point B. The only alternative was by sea voyage in the Mediterranean. On this side is the Arabian Desert. You don't want to spend a lot of time there. So the land bridge is critical from the time of Alexander, even before Alexander the Great. When we go back to the Babylonians and the Assyrians, it still was important because that was the connection to Egypt. I want you to notice one other thing. Alexander the Great is only in power between 11 and 13 years. And he starts it as a young man. So the 2 important things to note about this slide, and we're going to have a few more pieces, is first of all, the land bridge. Second, all this happens in a period. Alexander the Great's kingdom, the extent that you see here, all happens in a period of about 11 to 13 years. Now, why is it called Hellenization then, or Hellenism? Don't you want to know? Inquiring Mike. Mike, do you want to know?
Yes, sir.
Are we going to answer the question?
Rich mother or home is a woman that isn't she associated with Alexander the Great?
Close. Yep. Mike, did you have something you wanted to say?
I was just going to say, everywhere Alexander went, he planted Greek culture. He established cities that housed Greek culture. He was responsible for the spread of Greek culture all over his empire. And in a way, then he solidified the unity of that area.
All right. David?
Could you kind of explain what Greek culture was?
Uh-huh.
And just like how he implemented that?
Yep. Let's finish where Hellenization comes from, and then we'll get to that point, because that is an important point. That's a critical point for everything we've talked about. So I'll tell you kind of what that entails. But let's talk about where this term Hellenization comes from. It actually comes from, Mike's right about this, comes from the name Hellen, who was the son of Deucalion and Pyrrha. Deucalion and Pyrrha were gods in Greek mythology. So Helene was a Greek god as well. This is all comes from mythology. Alexander the Great claimed to be a descendant of Helene, the Greek god. Well, according to, if some of you probably want to read this, anybody ever heard of Ovid? Anybody know who Ovid was? Ovid was a Roman philosopher and poet. And he wrote something called the Metamorphoses. And the Metamorphoses, this is about the time, about the first century before the time of Christ. The Metamorphoses is 15 books of history and poetry. And in one of the books, he wrote that Deucalion and Pyrrha were the only survivors, I want you to listen to this, of a flood similar to one described in the story of Noah's Ark. Wait a minute. Other cultures knew something about a flood? You mean other cultures than what you read? That can't be right. In the Bible, it says there's this flood. Everybody says the flood never occurred. Well, let me finish the story on them first, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the flood. So the story was to repopulate the world after this flood. Deucalion and Pyrrha throw stones, which turn into people. And the first stones they throw becomes their son, Helene. Alexander the Great claimed to be in the line of Helene. That's why it's called Hellenization. Now, let's talk a little bit about the flood, and then we'll go back to David's question.
What was that? Who wrote that story?
His name's Ovid, O-V-I-D.
O-V-I-D.
He was a Roman poet in the first century. So this whole thing about the flood never occurred, right? Never happened. Anybody who believes that is crazy. Well, then you're going to have to explain to me why over 200 cultures throughout the world have a flood story, have exactly the same flood story. And it can't be because it spread from the Middle East, because cultures in Hawaii, Peru, Russia, Fiji Islands, the Aztecs of Mexico, up to the Bering Strait, cultures around the world have similar flood stories that have been in their histories forever and ever and ever. So you think maybe there's something to this flood deal? Now, David, let's come back and answer your question. What did it mean to adopt the Greek culture? Here's the first and most important ingredient of that. Every place that you see here, and by the way, well, you can see India here, as far as Greece there, and all the way down to Egypt, and everything that you see in yellow. Alexander the Great conquered. When he did, he required all of the people in those various areas to learn the Greek language. So the most important part of this is the Greek language. The second most important part of it was he forced them to learn about Greek culture, including mythology. And then finally, Greek way of dress. In other words, it was if you were to go into a conquered country and say, you can never speak English again in this country, you're going to have to speak Greek from this point on. That's what Hellenization was. Anybody ever wonder why the New Testament's written in Greek?
This is the most common language.
Now you know why. Now you know where it came from. Okay? So the Greek language. Kevin?
Just a quick question. So last week you made a quick comment. You said that at this point, first time that Western thought started. And so the first question I would have is, where's the delineator for Western versus Eastern? Number one. And then number two is, when we get into Jesus, when they talk about Gentiles, are they also thinking Western? Is that also big in that? Whether, the way they view Gentiles, that's the Western.
Mm-hmm.
That's that new thought. That part of that.
Not so much, but let's go back to your first question. How do you differentiate them? There isn't what I'd call a geographic demarcation. It's more a way of thought. Western thought, as an example, is more time-based. Time is more critical in Western thought than it is in Eastern thought. In Eastern thought, as an example, if someone says our feast is going to be on Tuesday, that can mean anywhere from Tuesday to Wednesday afternoon at any point in between. In Western thought, we would say what time and where. So Western thought is more time related, more what I would call concrete related, more factual related. Eastern thought more, I almost hate to say this word because it bothers me, spiritual. More spiritual, less dependent on time, more dependent on history and the cultures of the period than is Western thought. That help? Mike?
I would say that Western thought was more rational in so many aspects. An outgrowth of that was the creation of libraries in all of these Alexandrian cities that were established. And the biggest library that ever existed in the ancient world was Alexandria in Egypt, that unfortunately was burned out.
We're going to get to that here in just a minute. Let me finish the second half of your question. When you see the term Gentile throughout, and I have a good example of this. When you see the term Gentile throughout the Bible, it just means not Jew. In other words, it didn't have necessarily to do with Western or Eastern thought. It just meant they are not Jews. That's it. And I don't know if I used this example before. I told you that I was born here but grew up on the reservation, right, in Shiprock. In Navajo, the Navajo culture, there are only two kinds of people. There is Diné, which means the people, which means Navajo, and there's Belegana, which means everything else. So turns out, in my graduating class of 111, we had 11 white kids, one of which was black. And you're thinking, now how does that work? Well, in the Navajo culture, you're either the Diné or you're everything else. Very similar in terms of the way Gentiles were thought in terms of Judaism. So it wasn't necessarily a marker on Western thought, Eastern thought. It was more, you are not Jewish. That help?
It does, thank you.
So let's see. Let's talk a little bit here about Aleksandr. And I think I'm going to go to the next slide because it's actually a little better kind of explaining what's happening here. These are the battles that Aleksandr fought before turning east and going on to China. It's in China, actually, when they get on the doorstep of China, that his soldiers begin to revolt. And they say, we're not going any further. That's enough. So what happens is Aleksandr starts, as you would expect him to start. As soon as I can get a pointer there. And this would be Macedonia and Greece. And at this point, he is still fighting against the Persians. The Persians are still in control at this point. So he's pushing the Persians back. Ultimately, he's going to fight battles all across here with the Persians until he gets to the Battle of Issus. The Battle of Issus in 333 is kind of the deciding battle. He conquers the Persians, and we talked about this last week as well, that would be Iran. Conquers the Persians and they pull back. I want you to notice something that happens before he goes on. Can anybody see this little arrow right here? That's going on into Persia and India. Well, before he does that, he turns south. Remember how we talked about how important Egypt was? He turns south to come down and conquer Egypt. When he does, he goes to Tyre, and you'll notice here's Jerusalem. He goes through Gaza. Here's the siege of Gaza. He goes into Egypt, where he does found Alexandria. We'll talk a little bit about that, and then he comes back. Well, as I said, that turning point was the Battle of Isis. So Alexander passes through Judea on his way to conquer Egypt. He treated the Jews kindly, but was hostile to the Samaritans, who were somewhat against him. He displaced many of the Samaritans and settled Greeks in the area. Once again, what are we seeing? The diaspora, right? Well, Samaria was held in low esteem by the Jews, which we've talked about. And according to Josephus, you'll recall one of our kind of main characters that we've relied on is the historian Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish historian that wrote in the 1st century AD, and he's recounting all of this. He's done the history of the Jewish wars and the history of Judaism going back to almost the time of the Jews. Here's something that he writes. According to him, after taking Tyre and Gaza, Alexander the Great visited Jerusalem. After a brief visit, Alexander's forces continued south into Egypt, and then after conquering Egypt and founding Alexandria, which, by the way, was one of 20 Alexandrias that Alexander founded. I'm not sure I understand the connection here, but he founds Alexandria. He turns his forces east. Afterwards, he turns his forces east and goes through Damascus in 331 and pushed deep into the heart of Persia and around 331 as well. Now, there is a apocryphal story that you might find interesting. First thing I want you to notice, let's look at Alexander's route. He bypasses Jerusalem, goes down to Egypt, conquers Egypt, comes back through Gaza, passes Jerusalem again, and goes on to Tyre. Why would that occur? Why would he bypass Jerusalem? Jerusalem is a fairly important city at this time. Why would he bypass Jerusalem not once but twice? I think that's a great answer. We'll go with that one. But let me give you the apocryphal story behind it. An apocryphal story just means it's a story that people have heard, but they can't prove it. Josephus tells us two things. He says, first, during the siege of Tyre, Alexander calls on Jadus, who's the high priest at the time, high priest of the Jews, to come out and help him to overthrow Tyre. Jadus has pledged his allegiance to the Persian king. So Jadus says, I can't do that. Well, that's going to make Alexander furious. After conquering Tyre, he turns to ransack Jerusalem. That's the first part of Josephus' story. Here's the second part. Jadus, the high priest, has a dream, and all this is being related by Josephus, the historian, has a dream from God that he's to dress in his white robes and have all Jerusalem dress in white and go out to meet Alexander the Great in supplication. In other words, he's going out to say, we're bowing before you because we know you're going to conquer us. Alexander said that he had seen this high priest. He's never seen the high priest before. He's never even seen the garments or, as far as we know, anything about Jerusalem. So he says that he's seen the high priest in a dream before embarking on this whole campaign. Further, in his dream, the high priest had assured Alexander that he would be victorious over the Persians. So now you've got Alexander the Great, who was coming to conquer Jerusalem, not knowing that his dream is going to be the guy coming out of Jerusalem saying, I'm going to tell you that you're going to conquer the Persians. So Alexander's then taken into Jerusalem where he offers the sacrifice. And Josephus writes it this way, according to the high priest's direction. At that point, Josephus opens the book of Daniel. Remember, Daniel wrote, the book of Daniel is written 585 to 539, somewhere in that period. 200 years later, the high priest, and it wouldn't be a book, it would have been a scroll, he opens the scroll and he reads to him what we just read about the fall of the empires. And here's how Josephus wraps up the story. And when the book of Daniel was shown him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, which we just got through seeing, He supposed that he himself was the person intended, and he was then glad he dismissed the multitude for the present. Alexander the Great doesn't conquer Jerusalem, and I would make the case that divine intervention is not a bad concept. He does not conquer Jerusalem. He bypasses Jerusalem and goes on to conquer Persia because the book of Daniel prophesied that he was going to be the man to overthrow the Persian government. I thought kind of interesting. Now, let's go back to Alexander. Alexander goes on and he conquers pretty much, well, let's go back to this slide.
It's most of the known world, right?
Yes.
Good. So, are the dots representing, that's where a battle went on?
On which map are you on? This one?
Outside of Israel.
This one? Yes. Yep. But if you think about it, battles occurred all over the area. I mean, these were major battles. The Battle of Isis was the major battle.
I'm trying to think, by the time you, in a 3 or 4 year period, you're traveling that far, obviously some of your guys are getting killed at some point. You say, wait a minute, let's find some more guys here to fight these battles.
Well, except for, we'll come right back to you, except for this. You know what happens when he conquers them? Not only does he say, you're going to be part of the Greek culture from now on, but give me every one of your able-bodied men because they are now in my army.
That's one.
Question?
You died onto that, like the history says they were going to keep going, but he died, so they just stopped.
Actually, when he gets to India, he starts getting, the ranks start to say, we've had enough, man. Well, we've done all of this in 11 years. And they began to say, this is about as far as we're going to go. Alexander the Great's actually going to die in Babylonia, in Babylon, which is, well, I don't.
Was he on his way back?
He is. Yes, right. There's Babylon. So Alexander has already probably started on his way back. He's going to die in Babylon, which we'll come to later. But the reality was his soldiers by this. Alexander the Great wanted to go all the way to the Pacific Ocean, but the soldiers said, "I think that's enough for us," and they start to turn back. And we'll see who those soldiers are here in a minute. Does that help?
Where I have one dumb question. Where did they start? Or try to start in Athens? Where did Alexander?
It was called Macedonia at the time, but it was Greece. Okay. And Greece was composed of a number of what were called city-states. Athens was one, Sparta was one. They actually battled against each other quite a bit until Alexander the Great's father forms a coalition of these city-states to go fight against the Persians. So all of this was to go fight against the Persians. So Alexander the Great's going to start in Macedonia, which we would think of as Greece today.
And what were they fighting? Swords? How are they?
Swords, clubs?
Yeah, mostly at this time, it would have been swords, clubs, javelins, battle axes. Pardon?
Horseback?
Some, yeah. More were foot soldiers.
Actually, I watched YouTube. They went from like an 8-inch spear to where Alexander the Great, they were making spears that were like 18 feet long. And they were like the headman. Just like a lot of people got stabbed to death.
Skewered. Let's see, are we set? Okay. So Alexander the Great was committed to a Greek way of life, and as I said, he Hellenized all these nations. So as he conquered them, not only would he conscript soldiers who originally had to learn the language in order to exist in the army, but everyone in the cities behind him were required to learn the Greek language and Greek culture as well. That was why it was called Hellenization. There's an interesting tidbit here that you might find, well, I find it interesting. The word Palestine probably originates with Alexander the Great. And the reason for that is that, and this is the first time it's referenced as Palestine, it's originally from a Hebrew word. And the Hebrew word was Peleshet. The Peleshet in Hebrew means land of the strangers or sea people. And now you'll get a pretty good idea of where Palestinians originated. And I'll spend a little more time on that here in just a minute. The reason that Alexander, again, this is apocryphal, the reason that Alexander the Great called it Palestine is they said he was unable to pronounce Heleshet. Probably true if you ever hear the Hebrew language. The Hebrew language is very guttural, very difficult to understand. So he was probably, what he thought he was hearing was the term Palestine. That's how come he began to call it Palestine, and that's where the term comes from. So when you think about Palestine, and I need to get back down here for just a minute, in the Palestinian area, you need to understand that the Palestinians never occupied the original Palestinians, who ultimately become who? In Jesus' time, when actually in David's and Saul's time, these are the Philistines, right? Well, they came from Crete. They were Mediterranean people. They invaded this land. They actually tried to invade Egypt around, most people think around 1200. Egypt repelled them, so they settle here. So there is no connection, no DNA connection between Arabs and Palestinians. Palestinians were seafaring people, more allied actually to Macedonia than they would have been to any of the Arab nations.
You just made a lot of people.
I'm sorry? I'm sorry?
I said you just made a lot of people angry. People don't like the truth.
Anybody in this room get angry?
No.
Oh, good.
Nobody.
Well, that's the real story. So, how is that? Now,
So, do you have any idea when that move took place from Crete area over into?
yeah, I do. And Egypt has quite a bit of history on it as well. History about what they call the seafaring people, and they call them a different name. Might have been Hyksos, I don't remember. Coming into Egypt, and they defeated Egypt. This all would have been probably around 1200, between 1200 and 1300 BC. So if our timeline is right, Israel's already in the land, depending on, remember how we talked about it's either 1445 or 1260. Israel's probably already in the land when the Philistines come to occupy this area. We really see it under Saul and David and Solomon. They never, interestingly enough, they never conquer the Philistines. The Gaza Strip was never conquered, as were a couple of other areas that David and Solomon and Saul never conquered as well.
Why?
Couldn't do it. They tried. The tribe of Dan, one of the tribes of Jacob, that was supposed to be the area that Dan was allotted. Dan couldn't overthrow the Philistines, so Dan actually moves north. We'll see a picture of them here later. They moved north, and the Philistines continued to occupy the Gaza. Well, it wasn't called the Gaza Strip then. There were 5 kingdoms in Gaza that they occupied.
The Romans later conquered Crete and Greece.
Yep. As well as Israel and Gaza and everything in between. Yep. In fact, the Romans actually, I think I have this correctly, the Romans actually come into northern Africa and move east. And when Pompey conquers Israel, it's not from the north, it's coming from the south and the west. Let's see, let's move on here a little bit. And we're gonna move on pretty rapidly from Alexander the Great. Well, because Alexander moved on pretty rapidly from being Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, on his death, his death has been subject of a lot of debate over the years and the related events as well. But on his death, according to the Babylonian diaries, Alexander died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon between the evening of June 10th and June 11th, 323 BC, at the age of 32. Most people believe, today they believe, given what his symptoms were, that he died of malaria. But you'll find that he died of Some believe he died of malaria. Some believe he was poisoned. Some believe he died of syphilis. The rumors are rampant. Probably the most realistic is that he died of malaria. Now, you probably thought, well, why didn't his son just take over? Guess what? Didn't have a son yet. Although his wife was pregnant with Aleksandr, his successor at the time. When Aleksandr dies, there's no successor. So, according to a Greek historian, Alexander's companions asked him on his deathbed who should take over the kingdom. Because Aleksandr had what was called a half-wit brother. Can I say that today? Half-wit? And so that wasn't going to be him. So who was left? There's nobody in his line that can succeed him. And Aleksandr the Great was said to have said this on his deathbed. He said, and you'll have to, those of you who speak Greek can interpret this, toi kratostoi. Toi kratostoi means to the strongest. In other words, he said, you guys go figure it out. So he left it to his generals. And that's exactly what's going to happen next. So on the death of Aleksandr the Great, the empire split into 4 Hellenistic kingdoms. And we'll look at those right here. Lysimachus in Thrace and Asia Minor, the Antigonids in Macedonia, the Seleucids in Syria and Mesopotamia, and the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Mediterranean. Now, that's what this slide represents, is all 4 of those kingdoms, starting in Macedonia. We don't really care about what these guys are. You know who we want to talk about? We want to talk about these guys and these guys. These are the Ptolemies, these are the Seleucids. What's right between them? Israel. What we're going to see for the next 200 years is a tug of war between 2 of the offspring of two of the 4 generals of Alexander the Great, Seleucus and Ptolemy. Now, here's a good time once again. You remember how we've talked about how many times I wanted to bring this back to finding the hand of God? We're going to do it right here. Turn with me to Daniel 8, 1 through 4. Let's see. I want to go one more slide. We're going to read Daniel 8. We're going to read quite a bit of Daniel 8. We're going to start in verses 1 through 4. So if you've got your Bibles.
Something just come on me and find it interesting. So Israel has been battling over the Gaza Strip, which is this little piece of property for 2 years. But yet Alexander the Great conquered all that property in about 4. It's like,
well,
with spears.
I'd like to tell you that things are over and done with on the Gaza Strip. They aren't. There will continue to be, in my estimation, continue to be hostilities in Israel among these same people until the end of time.
Why is that?
That's it, pretty much. Hatred of each other.
Is it religion based?
2 things. More importantly, land.
But it's like not. I mean, yeah, I guess it's still land.
Well, not only that, but it's traditional land that the Palestinians have said truly belong to them, and Israel has said has truly belonged to them. So the first is land. The second is religion.
And how big of a race difference is it?
How big of a
race difference? Just like their race? Are they...
between when you say race, are you saying between the religions, between Jews and Islam?
Yeah.
Big.
It's, if this whole room was Islam, this would be Judaism. It's huge. Islam is the largest religion in the world.
And that's the Torah?
No,
Or Islam? Oh, no, never.
those are Muslims.
Yeah.
Islam. Yeah. Okay, so let's read. What was I going to read? Let's do that. Let's read Daniel 8, 1 through 4. In the third year of King Belshazzar. Does everybody remember who King Belshazzar was? Last week when we talked about the handwriting on the wall. Everybody remember that? So now we're back. He's kind of come back to revisit that. I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as he charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against him, and none could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and he became great. Now, it isn't too difficult to figure out who the ram was. The ram represents Persia. A 4th century historian states that the Persian ruler bore the head of a ram as he stood at the head of his army. So when we were seeing all those battles, whoever was at the head of the army would have had as a headdress the head of a ram. Rams were also stamped into all the coinage of the Persian Empire. So it's pretty clear here who Daniel's talking about. Let's go on, though, to verses 5 through 8, because I want to introduce another animal. As I was thinking about this, so far, who's Daniel talking about? He's talking about the Persian government, right, or the Persian Empire. Now listen to this. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between the eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. He came toward the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at him in great rage. I saw him attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering his 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against him, and the goat knocked him to the ground and trampled on him, and none could rescue the ram from his power. The goat became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Well, who do you think the goat is? Greece. And we have some extra biblical evidence for that as well. From ancient history, we know it wasn't strange. The goat wasn't a strange symbol. The goat was a common representation of the Greek Empire. Newton, one of the writers, properly observed that 200 years before the time of Daniel the prophet, they were called the goat's people. What Daniel just got through doing was prophesying what's going to happen, not just with the Medes and the Persians, but with the Greeks. And he does it 200 years before it occurs. I want to come back and deal with this in just a bit more, but I want you to notice something else that Daniel does. He identifies these 2 by name in the same chapter. Go down to verses 20 and 21, and here's what he's going to say. This is Daniel. The 2-horned ram that you saw stands for the kings of Media and Persia. The hairy male goat stands for the king of Greece, and the great horn that was between its eyes stands for the first king. That's Alexander the Great. Daniel names them by name 200 years before this occurs.
And so God was doing that to him through a dream.
You bet. Yep. One of the things we should keep in mind in all of this is while you won't see this part you see in the Bible, a lot of this other part you don't see in the Bible, this is God's hand all over everything, preparing the way for his son, who's going to show up in about 200 years from now, and preparing for the spread of the gospel. So keep that in your mind as we go through all of this. Now, let's go back to what we talked about earlier. Did you notice when I read earlier, I said, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off. The goat's large horn was broken off. Who was that? Alexander the Great. And notice what else it says. And in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Remember his 4 generals? Here is Alexander the Great. Here is Syria and Babylon, the Seleucids. Here is Asia Minor, Lysimachus. Here is the Ptolemies, Egypt and Judah. And here is Cassander, the 4 horns, the 4 generals that took over from Alexander the Great. Daniel prophesies all this 200 years before any of this occurs. That's the hand of God. Can't be anything else. Let's see. We know about these 4 guys, but we don't really care about 2 of them. We don't really care about Lysimachus. We don't really care about Cassander. Who we want to talk about are the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Those are the 2 we're going to talk about, because remember I said there's going to be a tug of war between them from now on. We're about out of time, so I'm going to stop in just a minute. Deb, did you have a question? Oh, I'm going to stop in just a minute, but before I do that, I want to finish with a piece of chapter 8 that is going to demonstrate something we talked about last week. You remember last week we had the discussion about prophecy, and that prophets in many cases had both a near-term vision and a long-term vision. Do you remember that discussion? And we talked about how it's best represented by going out and looking at the mountains. And you look out at the mountains in a range, and if you're quite a ways from them, you think it's all just one big mass of mountains. As you get closer, you realize there's some closer and some further back, right? I'm going to give you a demonstration of that. We're still in Daniel. We want to look at Daniel 8:13. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, how long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, and the surrender of the sanctuary and of the host that will be trampled underfoot. When we get a little further into this, we're going to talk about Antiochus Epiphanes, who will cause something called the abomination that causes desecration that Daniel just got through talking about. All right? Now, you don't need to go there. You can just listen to it, because I'm going to read Matthew. I'm going to read out of the book of Matthew. So now we're going to jump forward 200 years to Christ's time, to the book of Matthew, and I want you to listen to this. Matthew 24:15 through 16. So, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken about by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Jesus is saying this is a future event. Did you notice that? He's saying when you see this, he's talking about something that's going to happen in the future, but the first occurrence of it already happened during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, 200 years prior to that. Are you following me? That's a demonstration, a good demonstration of near-term and far-term prophecy. By the way, what chapter 24, you probably want to think of this, file it away. Chapter 24 of Matthew is something called the Olivet Discourse. That's just a fancy name for the time that Jesus takes his apostles into the Garden of Olives on the Tuesday before he's crucified. And the way it starts out is this. His apostles say to him, look at this grand temple. And Jesus says, there will be no stone unturned of this temple in the future. In other words, he says it's going to be demolished. So they get on to the Olive Garden on the Mount of Olives, and they're discussing it. And the disciples say, well, when will this occur? Chapter 24 of Matthew is Jesus telling what end times are going to look like. So if you want to know what Jesus himself says about end times, you'll find it in chapters 24 and 25 of Matthew, the Olivet Discourse. Pardon?
The abomination of desolation is when the Antichrist sits in the seat on the throne, proclaims himself to be God or Christ.
2 times. The first is Antiochus Epiphanes. We're going to come to him. He goes into the temple and he desecrates the temple in the time of the Maccabees. That's the first occurrence. That's the abomination of desolation in the Old Testament. So he desecrates the temple then. In end times, it'll be the Antichrist. Boy, a lot of stuff, huh? Is this making sense? Am I going too fast, too slow, too... But are you able to follow it? Good, because I can't. I'm having trouble. Well, let's stop there tonight because we've left off at a good point, and I will give you this teaser. Next week, we're going to talk about the Ptolemies. I'm sorry, the week after. You're right. Thank you, Andrea. We won't be here next week, but the week after. We will be here, and we'll talk about the Ptolemies, and this is a teaser for you. The probably most famous Ptolemy is Elizabeth Taylor. Well, actually, Cleopatra was a Ptolemy. So for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, Elizabeth Taylor played Cleopatra in the movie, but Cleopatra was the last of the Ptolemy line in 30 BC. All right. Wasn't that interesting? Now you got to go see Cleopatra in the movie. Questions, comments, thoughts? Are we ready to recess? Oh, yeah, sorry. Well, because we aren't there yet, but we will get there. When we get to, and what Michael was talking about was the library in Aleksandr. It was the world's most famous library at the time. Alexandria is where we're going to see something called the Septuagint written. So we're going to come back and visit Alexandria when we get into the literature of the period. That help? All right, let's see here. We need somebody. Oh, I'm getting a feeling. Oh, it's strong. Would you like to do a closing prayer?
Most gracious Heavenly